Hey guys, it's Camus, and we're going to talk about three pawns versus rook endgame. This position, you may have already noticed, is one of the endgame simulator positions. I'll put a link in the comments to it. You can try your hand at solving it. And it's actually a very tricky endgame. It doesn't stipulate, but according to the table basis, this position is a draw. Now, how to achieve that draw is not quite so straightforward. So, since there was no instruction or accompanying video, I thought I'd create one, and because it took me a while to figure this out. Okay, so in this position, obviously, White's hopes are into queen one of the pawns, and if Black doesn't play correctly, it's possible for White to win this position. Conversely, it's also very possible for White to lose this position. So I'm going to just go ahead with the solution, and we'll take a look at some other lines after we go through the solution. Okay, so if we want to verbalize the solution, we could state it as such: White creates a pawn chain and keeps his king near the base of the pawn chain to prevent the rook from being able to stop the pawns in the case of the solution on the g file. Okay, so how does this work in practice? Well, we can actually move any of the pawns and achieve the draw, but we'll just start with f5, and we'll come back and look at the other ones later. They're pretty much the same idea. Now, there's a number of things that the Black could do, but obviously moving his king closer to the pawns is something that most players would instinctively try here. So king to d6 is a good move. And now g5. And we're going to establish our pawn chain from e4 to f5 to g6. It could also go the other way. I'll show you that later. Now, before we go on to g5, let's look at what would happen if White played the rather obvious-looking king to f4. You would think that keeping the pawns in a compact group accompanied by the king is one way to ensure that the pawn's queen, or at least threaten the queen and force the sacrifice of the rook. But unfortunately, this is not correct, and this is the solution that I tried the first several times that I tried to play this position. So after king to f4, it loses, despite its logical nature, to something like rook to c1. Rook is going to harass the king from the back. Say e5 check, king to e7, g5, rook to g1, g6. Now we could try e6 here. What happens after e6? Well, rook to g2. Black just stays on the g file for the time being, and now we can't move the the f pawn because we'll lose the e pawn, and so the only pawn we can move is the g pawn. So we move king to g6. But now the king comes in, and it's got a real threat here. We're not going to be able to make any progress after something like king to e4, rook to f2, and now White loses because he's going to lose not only the f pawn, but the other two pawns as well because of Black's king position. So let's go back. Let's see here. Okay, instead of e6, which we played in the last variation, let's play g6. And it's going to be a similar kind of deal here. The king goes back and covers all three queening squares. Now, he can't advance. White can't advance the f or the g pawn. If he advances the f pawn, then the g pawn falls. If he advances the g pawn, then it falls. So he has to do something like e6, and now the harassment begins. Rook to f1, king to e5, king to g7, and again we can't advance these pawns with the exception of the e pawn, but after, say, Yeah, that's correct. If we move if we move e7, then a rook check will pick off that pawn in due course. So instead, we can try something like king to d6, king to f6, g7. Well, obviously, we're not making any headway here. King to c7, rook to g1, queens takes, king to d7, rook to g5, e7, rook to g7, and white's losing all his pawns in this variation. Okay, so let's go back to the position after king to d6. We tried king to f4. As I said, it's very logical looking, but it loses. So the solution requires us to play g5, establishing this pawn chain I spoke about earlier. And now king e5 is a logical move from black, and g6. Now we've established the pawn chain. This is the first part of our solution here. Now let's show a way for black to go wrong. It would make sense, given that the white king is protecting the e4 pawn, that we could pile up with it with the rook. But say we try rook to c4. Oddly enough, king to g3. King takes e4, f6, and now, if you know the basics of endgame theory, you realize that two connected pawns on the 6th rank are going to defeat a rook. So black can try something like rook to c3, king to g4, king to e5, g7, rook to c8, f7, rook to c4 check, king to g5, rook to c1, and actually white wins. There's no way for him to prevent both these pawns from queening. So oddly enough, if black captures that e-pawn, then he loses. Okay, so, and conversely, we'll see in a little bit, if white tries to defend the e-pawn, he loses. This is the counterintuitive nature of this position. So let's go back to king to e5, g6, establishing the pawn chain. Okay, so instead, black should play rook to c1, as we know that taking the e-pawn does not work. And now, the key to this solution is the counterintuitive king to f2. We're just completely giving up on the defense of the e-pawn. If instead that we tried to protect the e-pawn, let's go back, and we played king to e3, then we could lose via something like the following: rook to f1, king to e2, rook to f4, king to d3, rook to g4, keeping an eye on that g-pawn, since it's the most advanced pawn, king to e3, and now black takes the pawn with check, and this gives his rook an extra tempo here. The two pawns have not reached the 6th rank, so after king to d3, for instance, rook to g4, and now both pawns are under threat. We can't move either one. g7, of course, we just take this pawn, and then the other pawn falls. So, oddly enough, no matter who takes, if we try to defend the e-pawn, we lose. If black tries to take the e-pawn, he loses. This is very strange, but such is the nature of rook and pawn endgames. Let's go back to the mainline solution here. So after g6, we've just established our pawn chain. So rook to c1, and now this strange move, king to f2. And now, again, if black takes the e-pawn with the king, this doesn't work because we also get these two pawns on the 6th rank, and as we've seen before, this loses for black. So that the e-pawn is a hot one. So instead of let's say after king to f2, instead of black taking the e-pawn, he does something like rook to c3, trying to restrain the white king from getting any closer. Oh, excuse me. So where do we go? Oh yeah, king to f2, rook to c3, and let me do something here. And now king to e2. And what white is going to do, he's just going to shuttle his king back and forth between e2 and f2, and maybe in some positions f3. He's not going to attempt to defend the pawn. He's not going to try to do anything. His main job is just to keep the black rook from being situated on the G file. And so, for instance, if he goes to G3, we just attack the rook. And let's say he goes back, king to E2. We're just going to oscillate between E2 and F2. Rook to G3, king to F2, rook to B3, king to E2. And that's a draw, a 3-time turn repetition. Now, the only other try for black here, which is insufficient, is a rook to B2 check. But this also doesn't work. King to F3, rook to B8, king to E3. We're just keeping our king down. We're not going to try and force these pawns down. We're just happy with this structure. This structure is going to provide the draw for us because it's, in a sense, it's a kind of fortress. So rook to G8, king to F3, rook to C8, king to E3, king to F6, king to F3, rook to C1, king to E2, rook to G1, king to F2, and say rook to G5, king to F3, king to E5, king to E3, rook to G4. This line is Rybka's best line. So, in case it looks strange, apparently there are no better moves for either side than what you're seeing here. But king to F3, rook to F4, king to G3, king takes E4, and if rook takes, king to E4, and then G7 queen. So he can't take the pawn. And if, go ahead. I'm getting all confused here. Instead of king to E4, if you played rook to E4, it's the same thing, the pawn queens. And so after king to E2 in our original position here, rook to G3, king to F2, and we have this draw by repetition. Of course, the rook can go to other squares, but all we do is shuttle the king between E2 and F2, and it doesn't really matter where the rook goes. And if he dares to take the E pawn, then we simply win, as long as the rook is not on the G file. Okay, so now I said there were 3 ways you could actually move any of the pawns from the original position, but we'll go through these quickly, and you can see that the solution is similar. Okay, so for instance, you could play G5, king to D6, G6, king to E6, F5, and now we've got a pawn change just going in the opposite direction, but the structure is essentially the same. So anyway, you can also try from the start position 1E5. It doesn't really make any difference. Rook to C1, king to F2, king to D7, F5, rook to H3, king to G2, rook to E3. Again, we have our pawn chain. King to E7, king to F2, rook to B3, and then we're going to have a similar situation. So you can move any one of those pawns, but the idea is to construct this pawn chain. And you leave one of the pawns home and move the other 2 to construct the chain. Then keep the king on the second rank so that the king can control the rook's access to the file directly opposite the pawn that is most advanced. Let's go through the solution from the very beginning again, because this is a solution that you can use to defeat the endgame simulator. So F5, king to D6, G5, king E5, G6, rook to C1, king to F2, this hard to find move, rook to C3, king to E2, king to F2, rook to G3, king to F2, rook to B3, and then we have a draw by repetition. Rook to G3, king to F2, rook B3, king to E2, rook to G3, king to F2. And that's the draw. So I hope you learned something. I know I did from trying to solve this study. And also, at the end of the video here, I'd just like to put a plug for Qatar's offer to donate $500 to UNICEF. So remember, video producers, he's going to dedicate a certain amount of money for each UNICEF tagged video produced. And so I encourage you all to support him in that effort. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you soon. Goodbye.